From Interfaith Alliance, this is State of Belief Radio. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Rauschenbusch, broadcasting this week from New York City.
No, religion isn't dead. It's just taking new forms. Millennials haven't lost faith. They might not call it God, as I do. They might call it love. They might call it community. They might just call it a higher spirit.
We live in an age of yes and, seemingly endless opportunities for connecting along intersecting identities and priorities, giving greater voice to what we have in common and learning deeply from our differences. As we turn the calendar page to March, celebrated as Women's History Month, I'm excited to have Reverend Jennifer Bailey, founder and executive director of Faith Matters Network, with us. You can hear State of Belief on the radio and get the podcast on Apple Podcasts and all other podcast platforms. Every week, I am in conversation with some of the most fascinating, impactful civic and religious leaders across the nation. Please subscribe to it today. State of Belief Radio is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you for helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how you can help keep this show on the air is available at stateofbelief.com. And you can find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and join us at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my guest. The Reverend Jennifer Bailey is an ordained minister, public theologian, and national leader in the multi-faith movement for justice. She is the founder and executive director of Faith Matters Network, a womanist-led organization equipping community leaders, faith leaders, and activists with resources for connection, spiritual sustainability, and accompaniment. Reverend Jen is also co-founder of the People's Supper. Reverend Jen, welcome to State of Belief Radio.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Paul, it's so good to be with you. I miss you. It's been a while since we've been together.
I feel exactly the same way. So let's get into it. What is really your focus right now? You have a young one. You have a whole world that involves young people, but then you also have the broader world of your ministry and your commitments. Like, you woke up today and you had to deal with a young one, but then also you're going to have to deal with the state of our nation. And I'm just wondering, what is sustaining you on this day?
Thank you so much for that question. I would say toddler giggles. So I am the mother of a 2-year-old son, Max, who is just the light of my life and the bane of my existence and all of the things.
I love that it's both those together. I relate.
I've described parenting as just a joyful pain in the butt. And I feel like it is, he has become over the last 2 years, my greatest teacher. And I'll share with you because and past the first trimester, we're expecting a second. So I will be a mama times 2 this July. And so I'm just really excited as we're expanding our family. And, I mentioned Max and the baby that is coming, in part because what really has been driving me over the last 2 years is asking the question of the world that my children are inheriting. I'm 35 years old and a millennial, which is not quite as young as it used to be. And one of the key questions I think that has been at the core of my inquiry, both in my vocational life and my spiritual life, has been this question of what it means for us to pass on legacy. What is it that we're inheriting? And then what is it that we want to pass forward? And, I didn't know when I got pregnant the first time around that I would be giving birth in the middle of a global pandemic, that the summer before Max was born in September of 2020, we would be in the midst of a moment of racial justice uprisings following the murder of George Floyd. I didn't know as I was preparing to give birth just the dire state of our climate. And as it is, 70 something degrees in February in Nashville, Tennessee right now, right?
Right.
And it feels very precarious.
It does.
And at the same time, I am a Christian in the Black church tradition, and I believe in hope and not like a loose hope that is based on sort of a frivolity of aspiration, but a hope that is deeply rooted in recognizing the legacy that I, as a Black woman, carry forth in my DNA from strong women who survived against all odds and laid the foundation for me to be here. So
Isn't that? I
lots,
mean, it reminds me
lots on
of
my
your
mind.
book. I just want to, the to my beloveds letters on race, on faith, race, loss, and radical hope. I mean, tell us a little bit about that. Like, to my beloveds. I mean, every word there is so rich with meaning. And, when you're talking about, who came before you, what you have inherited, and then also what you view as your legacy. It's this stream, this mighty river. And so tell us a little bit about that book.
Yeah, wow. That book was a long time coming, as my publisher would tell you. Um, and I kind of reached the point where I think I was like 6 months pregnant, and I was like, either this is going to get written or it's not. um,
Mm,
and and I think one of the things that really drove my inquiry in that book was this question about how we sit with the the reality and the heaviness of loss. I
mm,
lost my mother in 2016, have lost some dear friends, including one of my best friends from high school who passed away about 3 weeks after Max was born.
mm,
And so much of my young adulthood was characterized by loss. And so I found myself in the midst of this global pandemic where we were suffering losses that seemed just too great to fully perceive, asking myself, what have I learned along the way that might be useful to other folks? And what is the sort of dialogue that I want to have both with the past and with the future, with the
mm.
senior saints and the playground prophets, with the folks that I think are going to help us chart a new way, a new path forward. And so the book is a series of letters that I write to people, both that I know and folks that I imagine to be part of my beloved community, um,
Mm, mm,
around some of those topics. So those letters touch on everything from the loss of my mother to a letter that I wrote to Max when he was still in my womb about sort of my
mm.
hopes for him as a child who is both Black and Jewish and is emerging at a time of, you know, very palatable anti-Black racism, but also rising anti-Semitism in the world.
Oh,
And what does that
it's,
mean for him and the shaping of his identity as a young person and as a child? It's also, I touch on my own mental health struggles and suicidal ideation as a young person, and two friends in the text that I lost to suicide in my early 20s. And so, I think it is easy sometimes for people of faith and those of us who have been called into formalized ministry to sort of to shy away from the hard stuff because we are expected to perform a role in public. And so part of the invitation of the book is to step in. I think that's why I wrote it in the way that I did. And I signed the letters with different forms of my identity, right?
mm,
As as a as a daughter, as somebody's mama, as an auntie in training. I write a letter to Gen Zers in the book, right?
uh-huh.
And so it was also in part an exploration of my own growing sense of identity at a time where I think in my early 30s I had felt pretty stifled and limited by sort of the public performance of preacher and
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
pastoral leader, and had lost a sense of who I was outside of that, which I think is often true for folks who serve in roles that are publicly facing.
Yeah, I think often you find preachers facing that at 60 and 70 with a little bit more regret. and you're offering people the opportunity to really have that part of what it means to be a minister, the vulnerability, the recognition of struggle. That book is To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. One thing that you're involved with which I think is just really important at this time, is a kind of a collective weave, and it's something that is dedicated to the cultivation of trust. And I feel like that is something that we're impoverished. We're trust impoverished. I feel like almost every interaction on the street, in any situation, like the question of trust, even if it's not acknowledged, it's there. Tell me a little bit about Weave and what that's all about.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to be a part of what I think is a growing ecosystem of work that is dedicated to doing deep bridge building work that is intended to see not through or beyond our differences, but attempt to reach out to make meaning and understanding of our differences, especially globally, but especially in the US context where difference has been viewed as a detriment to our democracy sometimes rather than an asset, right? Like as a source of conflict. And so one of the things that I think is so beautiful about Weave in particular is that in the context of this larger project of bridge building that's afoot in the country, Weave has really turned its attention to this question of trust, as you were mentioning. And we know that social trust has been declining over the last 50 years in the United States, at the same time that loneliness has been rising. I think the statistic is something like 54% of Americans say they no longer have someone in their life who knows them well, and 39% say they're no longer close to anyone. What's so interesting, if you look at some of the loneliness demographics, is that I think there might be an assumption that sits largely with elders. But what we see is that it's not just older generations, but it's younger generations as well that are reporting this high degree of loneliness. And it's devastating. And I think for me in particular, as a person who grew up in a spiritual community and context that was deeply intergenerational, that was deeply family oriented, where I knew that I not only had my parents to take care of me, but a network of adults who saw me and loved me, right? To think that those spaces are becoming less and less common is devastating, as we are living less and less in intergenerational community and more in these sort of isolated silos. So one of the beautiful things about Weave, which is a project of the Aspen Institute, is that Weave is a collective and community of folks who are building trust from the ground up. They aren't necessarily looking for common ground, but are looking to work to remember our common humanity and to see the worth in everyone. We all know weavers in our own communities, whether it's the abuela who sits on the block, who has like an eye on everybody's kids, right? Or, teachers who see an issue in their community and just, see that kids are hungry and do food drives, right? Those folks who are naturally inclined towards this notion of weaving and building deeper connection. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's been a real gift.
Well, and I honestly, and this is flattery or compliment, but I view you as that person. I really do. So that it makes total sense that you're a leader in this network. And I do feel like in the wider world in which I sit, Reverend Jen Bailey has a particular place in bringing people together, finding ways to work together. So it's such an identity for you in a very positive way, and not in, again, the fluffy way, but in the serious way. And one of the things that I personally struggle here, I see the ways certain people are treated, and I feel threatened by certain rhetoric that I hear, for my own family and for people I love. And so it is hard for me to kind of blend this idea of how do I find trust with someone else, even as I feel very threatened and recognize the potential harm that can happen to me. And so how do we blend that? How do we blend social justice, the work towards ensuring that our communities are safe and respected, with the idea of understanding the humanity of all sides?
Yeah, I think this is a key question. And part of that inquiry begins within, right? And so, I think it is John Powell who talks a lot about the length of bridges that we're willing to bridge, right? Sometimes
Mm,
it's easier to cross a short bridge than a long bridge. And I would also say that as we think about this work of bridge building or weaving, whatever metaphor you might use for this metaphor of trust building and relationality, there are situations where, for some of us, depending on how we are embodied in our identities and our commitments, that it may not be safe for us to do bridging work in a particular
mm,
moment. But there are opportunities and moments where we might feel called to because of our own sense of community and who that community is. And so this is where I think I feel a lot of gratitude in my tradition for this notion of discernment, right? Like
mm,
really being able to sit and wade in the question of how am I called to weave or bridge in this season? With whom am I called to do it? Where am I bridging to, or what is the goal of the weaving that I'm up
mm-hmm,
to?
mm-hmm.
And what are we bridging over, right? Like what are some
Right.
of the histories and realities and truths that need to be spoken in order for us to authentically come to the table to have conversations? And in some cases, right, that work is just about doing the work together, right? If you
Yeah.
were living in a
Yeah.
community, thinking about the crisis in East Palestine, Ohio, right, where living in the midst of an environmental justice crisis after a train has dumped toxic chemicals all over your
Mm,
community into your watershed, everybody has a rallying cry, right, around the health and well-being of their families and communities that can serve as a space while
mm,
working towards a common goal to
mm.
bridge divides as you're working towards that sort of aspiration of more healthy and full lives and justice,
Yeah.
right?
To not let it be a stumbling block.
Hmm.
Like not the either or. I mean, you're very much like yes and it's not like that involves like a complex system, and not saying we're not going to do bridge building work and ignore the reality of our lives and how we're feeling. We're actually going to bring that into the conversation, and we're not going to stop trying to build a bridge just because we're fearful. It actually is a way forward. Discernment is a way forward. Up next, more with Reverend Jen Bailey, co-founder of the People's Supper. If you miss any part of today's program, you can hear full episodes of State of Belief anytime on our website. You'll also find links to the topics we discussed today, extended interviews, and transcripts, as well as an archive of past shows, all on stateofbelief.com. You're listening to State of Belief Radio, where religion and democracy meet. I want to ask you a little bit about Faith Matters Network, which I have just admired since the moment you created it. It's so interesting. You use the term that may not be familiar to all of our listeners, which is womanist. Can you talk a little bit about what womanist means and what's involved in a womanist, an organization that has womanist ideas at its core?
Oh, absolutely. Well, as I think about what it means to self-identify as a womanist and womanism, for folks who may not be familiar with womanism, womanist theology and ethics really is a theoethical praxis. That's a fancy way of saying way of life and being that places at the core of its analysis the lived experiences of African American and Black women. And in particular, thinking about the intersecting ways in which things like race, class, and gender, um, sexual orientation, right, inform how we, as Black women, have moved throughout the world and influenced both our view of the divine and of community. And so much of our work at Faith Matters Network begins through that lens. I have a wonderful mentor who Paul knows, Lisa Anderson, who says Black women have never had a vision of liberation that has never been inclusive of everyone, right? Because we know that if we who have been cast aside, maligned, and placed to the very edges of society are working towards a vision of wholeness and community that uplifts us and our people, then everyone else will be included in that vision as well. And so at Faith Matters Network, I'm really privileged to work alongside some incredible women. 70% of my staff identifies as women of color. 100% of our senior leadership team is Black women. And that informs our lived experience, informs our practice, but doesn't inform, it informs the way that we offer radical hospitality to all. So our programs aren't exclusively for Black women, although that is the positionality out of which we operate. And our work is really committed to working alongside and accompanying spiritually grounded leaders on their journey to heal themselves and their communities. And that has manifested over the years in a number of different programs and projects that have at the core of its analysis really this notion of what it means to be in the business of healing, recognizing that the work of healing is not a destination, it is a journey, whether we're talking about that project within ourselves or whether or not we're talking about that project in the context of our society as a whole. And so really grateful for some of, my womanist mentors, people like the Reverend Dr. Emily Towns and Reverend Dr. Stacey Boyd Thomas, who taught me at Vanderbilt University Divinity School, which I'm a proud alum, but also for some of those unspoken womanists in my life. And by unspoken, I mean like folks in my life who would have never had the terminology to call themselves a womanist, but those church mothers of my childhood who very much embodied sort of the radical hospitality and audacity and boldness and commitment to community that really seeded and empowered me as a little Black girl growing up in Quincy, Illinois, to see myself beyond the limitations that others might put on me.
It's so powerful. And, I was privileged to go to seminary when Dolores Williams was teaching at Union, and Lisa Anderson, who is one of my greatest teachers and mentors and friends, was one of my tutors, meaning like she was the exalted PhD folks and I was the lowly MDiv. But, it really enlivened my spirituality to imagine the world and also, find locuses of meaning that were not introduced to me, frankly, in other spaces, and also change my kind of center of gravity a little bit to look towards other places for wisdom and also commitment, where my commitments might lie, with my privilege, frankly, as cis white male who has a lot of privileges that come with that. And so, so it's just been, I just appreciate you sharing with us what womanist means, and especially as we're entering Women's History Month, it's just important to recognize that this is a place where people can come together and find meaning, and the incredible strength of Black women in this country. But also, like I want to make sure I say it right, but we're not going to step over the bodies in order to get to our liberation. We're not going to step over the dead bodies in order to get to our liberation. And I think that is like also like the healing and the kind of process. And so I just really appreciate that. Tell me a little bit about the People's Supper. I know that that may not be your day-to-day, but that was a really important idea that you did that took a lot of work. Yeah. And I'm not sure this. I think it started pretty soon after the election of 2016, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell me a little bit about that. The People's Supper.
So the People's Supper was a project that got seeded after the 2016 presidential election, although the roots of it actually predated the presidential election results. It's in conversation with two dear colleagues, Emily May and Lennon Flowers, each of whom run their own really beautiful organizations. Emily runs an organization called Right to Be. Lennon runs an organization called The Dinner Party. And throughout that election cycle, I think the three of us were just acutely aware, and who knew how prophetic we would be of just how toxic the rhetoric in our politics had become, and how triggering for so many people the election cycle was. And so, we thought about doing something together in the aftermath of the election to try to give space to hold some of the experiences people were holding. And then, 2016 happens, and there's just sort of like this outpouring of, in some cases, elation, right, from certain corners, but in many of our communities, a sense of grief and fear being at the center of many folks' reactions. And so the People's Supper began as a project called 100 Days, 100 Dinners. We hosted our first suppers on Inauguration Day 2017 with a goal of doing two things. One, creating spaces around dinner tables for folks to come together and build trust across lines of difference, whether that be political, racial, ideological difference, and try to get back to a place of seeing one another as deeply human again. And spaces that we at the time called healing suppers that were really all about folks who were in communities who were feeling particularly either under threat or who, for whom the state of affairs in our political environment was anxiety producing, to create sacred spaces for them to be with one another and sort of fortify their own sense of strength in community. And so, over the past, 5+ years, the People's Supper has hosted thousands of suppers across the country, with that aim towards having tough conversations about the places and spaces and things that can hurt us most, but in communities that we care about. And so I invite folks who are interested in the People's Supper. It's still going strong under the leadership of our dear friends at the Dinner Party, to check out the People's Supper website. We've moved there are models if you'd like to host some in your own communities with free guidebooks and directions on how to do that. But the model has really shifted to go even deeper in communities and walk with folks and accompany them over the course of not just one supper, but several, as a way of, again, going back to the notion of weaving, right? Weaving community.
And building trust. It's extraordinary. I want to go back to something you said earlier that struck me about Max, and that he was going to be growing up both as a person who is Black and also Jewish. And I'm just wondering, how do you understand the anti-Semitism rise in this day?
Yeah. I mean, so there's so much to say about that. As somebody who is married to a Jewish man and who we've chosen to raise Max with Judaism being his primary religious home, it's probably an odd thing for a clergy person in the African Methodist Episcopal Church to do, but felt right for us and our family for a number of reasons. The thing about anti-Jewishness that is true is that it always comes in cycles and waves, right? And so where there are moments of sort of uprising and scapegoating, in particular of Jewish identified folks, as a way of putting off a sense of blame shifting for certain political and social circumstances. I mean, you can go back to like this notion of blood libel from the Middle Ages, right? There always happens in cycles. And so I don't think that it is a coincidence that we are seeing this uptick and rise of anti-Semitic violence at the same time that we have sort of a larger uptick in violence against Asian Americans and, vehement anti-Blackness that is also, permeating. And I would say, a deepening rise in sort of white Christian nationalism that very much places at the center of its analysis a sort of exceptionalism of whiteness. And I'm going to distinguish that from white people, right? Because I think when we talk in these terms, it's important to both name the ideology for what it is, and that people are more complicated than that sometimes, right? And so, you know, it's also true in the US that Jewish folks make up less than 10% of the population. So the reality is that many people don't know Jewish folks, right? They don't have them in their community or in their families or in their lives. And so, again, when you don't know, it's easy to project onto people sorts of stereotypes and understandings that are not grounded in reality, but based in ignorance. And all of that is true. And, you know, I live in the South. I live in a context that is very much competes as one of the buckles of the Bible Belt. And so it feels really important to me as I think about what it means for Max to be cultivating both a Black identity. I mean, he's real cute, Paul, like, but he can't pass, right? Which was, you know, honestly, this is very vulnerable to share, but it's one of my biggest fears when, like, I was giving birth was like, is he going to be recognizably my child, right? Or are people going to assume that I'm the help in this situation, right?
Oh, Lord.
Which is, you know, my own set of stuff. But it could be really easy for him to grow up in this context and not have a sense of his own identity as being Jewish and having Jewish heritage. And so it takes a great deal of intention to do so. And for him to embrace both of his identities, not as in competition or in conflict, but just a part of the legacy that he has inherited and something to be deeply proud of. I write in my book that he is, you know, the product of people who survived the Shoah and people who survived chattel slavery, right? Like in his bones are folks who, and in his DNA are people and stories, more importantly, of communities that not just survived, but thrived against the greatest odds, against contexts that were meant for their literal destruction. And so it feels really important for me to ground him in a sense of that history, in a sense of that lineage and legacy, while also helping him recognize it as a strength and a superpower.
Well, and you know, that's absolutely. I mean, there's also the unfortunately, it may be a corollary, but there is with both of those communities, there's incredible wealth of spiritual, moral, cultural power that is, you know, part of his legacy. I think that you said it so beautifully, and I really appreciate that. And this is something, you know, obviously really personal to you and something that you're living with every day. And, you know, it's interesting. We kind of started out with this conversation about Max and about your broader life. And I want to bring it back to one final question that we touched on also earlier, but I'd love for you to offer it to our listeners again, is what gives you hope right now?
Oh, so many things give me hope right now, honestly. I sense hope in Max's laugh and giggle, his like mischievous giggle when he's causing mischief with his friends or discovering something new that he loves, whether that be trains or marching bands, right? Like he's really into HBCU, historically Black college marching bands. And I love that. And I want him to cultivate that, right? Like there's a sense of wonder there, you know. I have a deep sense of hope when I look at the amazing community organizing that has been done throughout the South for a long time of folks organizing for rights. In hostile political context, I feel a great deal of hope in the conversations that I get to have over dinner tables with college students and elders, asking them the question of what they envision as the good life. So I guess my hope is grounded not necessarily in systems of politics or power, but in people. Knowing that people will disappoint me, and people do disappoint me, and I will disappoint folks, right? Like in my letter to Max in my book, I say, I'm your mama and I will disappoint you and I will get it wrong, right? Like, let's own that now, and I will apologize, because that's the type of parent I want to be. And I'm already in the practice of doing that with him. And as we're moving towards a new era in human existence, the thing that I keep going back to, whether we talk about automation or AI or just the reality of a changing climate, the one thing we can't replace or replicate is the care that we show to one another. And, it is my hope, even as we see so many systems falling apart and things beginning to crumble, that in this apocalyptic uncovering moment, we will also see the sparks of creativity, imagination, and new life that might guide us forward. Please stay in touch. You can follow our work at faithmattersnetwork.org. And also please check out the work of Weave, the Social Fabric Project at the Aspen Institute. It is a community that is nationwide, that is doing amazing work, asking this question of how do we rebuild trust? And it is open to everyone. And their website is simply weareweavers.org.
The Reverend Jen Bailey is founder and executive director of Faith Matters Network and co-founder of the People's Supper. She's the author of the book, To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. Jen, thank you so much for being with us today on State of Belief Radio.
Thank you.
And with that, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for this week's show. We need your help keeping this show on the air, and I hope you'll consider being a partner in this crucial work by making a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And you can also be part of making sure informative and encouraging voices like this are heard by sharing this program with friends and family. Let's get more people listening and more people taking part in these conversations, both on and off the air. Never miss an episode by subscribing to the weekly State of Belief podcast on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. And join the conversation. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at State of Belief, and share State of Belief with the people in your life. State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Rauschenbusch on State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.